Part 2 of executive functioning. We will focus on strategies for executive function, support, and skill development. This presentation will focus on the strategies to support individuals with executive function skill deficits and to promote skill development. As you learned in the previous executive function presentations, that although executive function develops as a developmental process, beginning as early as before 1 year of age and continues to approximately age 25, that many individuals may in fact not adequately develop these skills by adulthood. Given the neuroplasticity of the brain, however, these skills can be explicitly taught, developed, and strengthened through practice and repetition at any age. Our objectives for today are to discuss general strategies to support executive skill development, review strategies for specific executive function skill deficits, begin to be able to identify specific skills that might need to be taught, self-reflect, and consider strategies to be used in the future. Key to skill development is having a highly structured environment. Within that, there are a few things that I'd like to mention in terms of seat assignment. So generally, an individual that may have executive function skill deficits and has difficulty focusing their attention or sustaining their attention would be to have a seat assignment that would be closer to the instructor. Also, positioning is important. Facing forward and looking at the speaker as opposed to being in a cluster or looking at and getting information sideways. So seating arrangement is something that the instructor would need to assess in terms of what will work best for the group as well as for specific individuals. Although it's important to create an environment for open communication and positive interaction, it's also essential when providing instruction or directions to be concise, clear, and whenever feasible, couple any verbal instruction with written, visual, or even permanent product models for the individuals to be able to refer to. Another thing that may occur is various situations or problems. Whenever situations occur, it's going to be important to model the process of problem solving. Problem solving is often an issue with individuals that display executive function skill deficits. So it's going to be important to be empathetic, identify the problem, and gain some information, and then assist the individual in identifying all possible solutions. Once a solution is selected, assist the individual in making a plan. Now, we all know we can make a plan, but it's going to be important to actually follow through on all the increments of the plan. So monitoring and support to follow through, and possibly even then evaluating the outcome of the solution. Did it work or not? The instructional atmosphere should always include opportunities for discussion and reciprocal dialogue. The amount of positive feedback should always exceed the corrective feedback. Remember, the goal is a 5-to-1 ratio between positive statements and any corrections. What do we know about the best ways to provide information? Of course, there is verbal language. However, we also know that not everyone's learning style lends to auditory input. When thinking about learners who may be neurodiverse or individuals who may have some executive function skill issues, we want to present information using multiple modalities. Well, what does that mean? So various materials can be used across the 4 main modes. Some are listed on this slide, But the main areas are visual, auditory, read or written, and kinesthetic, or otherwise known as physical activity. Research also suggests that small group instruction works best for most people versus whole group. Small group instruction allows for increased engagement with more opportunities for discussion and/or clarification. It also allows for more individualized support if necessary, and the instructor can identify more readily if someone is struggling and needs more support or perhaps a different approach. Another consideration is to minimize visual and auditory distractions in the environment. Whenever feasible, remove extraneous items on the walls and materials that aren't being used in the moment. Lighting is often an issue with fluorescent lights for both visual and auditory distraction purposes, as well as heating or cooling systems. Of course, these are often necessary, but being aware that for some learners, these can interfere with their ability to focus and attend to the instruction. Closing doors and utilization of signs, class in session, testing in progress, can also be useful to minimize unnecessary outside interruptions. We also know that typically people maintain their attention for a maximum of an hour and a half for lecture types of presentations and instruction. Therefore, if we're not using multiple modalities for the instruction, it is suggested that the instructor plan for at least a 10-minute motor or brain break every hour to hour and a half. Movement can in fact improve one's ability to focus and sustain their attention to task or instruction. If instruction carries over after a meal, such as lunch or dinner, it will be important to take about 15 minutes to get everyone re-engaged in the class. One way to accomplish that is to do a quick review of what was covered previously and check for understanding or see if there's any questions. Last but not least, plan to introduce new or more challenging instruction earlier in the class, when individuals are more likely to have more energy and be more alert. Most likely, concepts and tasks will need to be broken down into smaller presentable components. Instructing one step at a time and checking to see if the learner is able to perform the step or operation before moving on to the next may be necessary for some individuals who have executive dysfunction. Total task presentation, where all the steps are taught at once, can be very challenging for some learners. We have already mentioned the importance of using various visual and auditory supports, but this cannot be emphasized enough. In addition, providing notes, highlighting the need to know, and even diagrams can be very helpful for individuals with executive dysfunction. As we know that rehearsal and repetition are integral for them to internalize the information being instructed. Some individuals can struggle with being able to separate information that is nice to know from the essential need to know components. We also know that with executive dysfunction, transitions and shifts within or between activities and tasks can be extremely challenging. So being planful to allow sufficient time between activities, but to also provide structure during those transitions themselves. Gaining as well as maintaining attending behavior before and also during the delivery of directions and instruction are going to be essential in terms of assisting individuals that have some executive function issues in the attention area. Some examples of attending behaviors to look for include verbal and nonverbal cues to the instructor that the listener is actually paying attention. Some of them include eye contact or at least the individual looking in the speaker's direction, as we know that some individuals who are neurodiverse are not comfortable maintaining eye contact for extended periods of time. Body language, especially posture, looking for open and interested posture towards the speaker. Various facial expressions that demonstrate connection with the speaker. Vocal qualities such as statements or connected vocalizations such as asking questions of the speaker, nodding, head movements in agreement, and then tracking, looking at and following along with available material. The instructor should, either with their tone of voice, volume, or some visual gestural prompt, emphasize and cue the student to key information. Prompting. Remember, prompting in a positive manner can increase engagement and the individual's participation. This can be done by the instructor asking questions related to understanding, moving in close proximity, but walking around the room and stopping to check on everyone's progress, not just one individual's. Anticipatory cues are also going to be very important. Whenever there is a change or a shift, such as when something will be ending, or even when something is about to begin. In 5 minutes, we will be moving on, or in 2 minutes, we will need to stop. I have included in this presentation some self-directed activities. This is activity number 1. So the steps involved are to review the next 7 slides on your own. I will be going over some brief reminders based on our first presentation for each of the core areas. Each slide will represent one of those 7 core areas of executive function, but then also has some strategies listed specific to that core area. For example, attention, planning, time management, so on. Following the 7 slides, there will be 4 case examples. Those will be your activity number 2. Additional directions will be provided for the case example self-directed activity. I believe you can look back at the executive function initial presentation, but just as a reminder, for attention, remember that there are 3 types of attention: focused, sustained, and shifting. Remember, for planning, task analysis, or breaking down concepts and tasks into smaller steps or components, is going to be important. Also, time increments towards completion and planning for that even before beginning the task or the product. And last but not least, stepped goals towards the end product. How are you going to get there? What are the steps involved? Remember, for time management, this is going to involve prediction, planning, time allotment, the implementation as you have planned, and then accomplishing the task or achieving the end goal. For initiation, you're going to need to take time to actually process the information. And for some individuals, this may look like procrastination, but it may actually just be processing time. But then getting started is going to be imperative. And you have to keep going to the finish line. Remember, working memory is a very complex process, and it involves receiving the information, then arranging it, storing it, and then being able to retrieve it to be applied at a later date and to different situations. Organization requires developing routines, sequencing expectations, and then maintaining order and structure. Emotional control involves various skill sets. One in particular is problem-solving skills, self-monitoring, and the ability to self-regulate, or otherwise known as self-soothing. Navigating interactions and mediating situations. Impulse control involves the ability to stop, think, plan before acting, and the ability to predict the outcome of one's actions and assessing the possible response. Now that you've had an opportunity to briefly review the 7 core areas of executive function and look at the slides for plausible strategies for each of those core areas, read each of the case examples. There are a total of 4. Attempt to identify the executive dysfunction or need for each. There may be more than one for each of those cases. Refer to the previous slides if you need to for potential strategies related to the executive function deficits you have identified, and try to select at least one strategy for addressing each of the needs. And then, when you're done, reflect on how this information may influence your practices in the future. Case example number 1 is Alicia. Case example number 2 is Dimitri. Case example number 3 is Jaquan. Case example number 4 is Simone. Patience is key when working with individuals that have executive dysfunction, but it's important to remember that these individuals are going to require support in developing these skills. There are many other factors that can impact on an individual's executive functioning. So I added an additional slide for a few things to consider when instructing individuals who present with executive function challenges. Some things to think about is, what is their inability to engage or being alert related to? Did they get an adequate amount of sleep? Have they eaten? Are there any underlying conditions that might be impacting their ability to focus and attend? Is the task aligned with their style of learning? And is it of interest? Is the amount of time or presentation aligned with their attention span? These are just a few things to think about and consider when providing instruction. This is the last activity for the presentation, and it is a self-reflection exercise. Think about, across those 7 core areas of executive function, what strategies do you utilize to support better collaboration and relations with your students in promoting their strengths and supporting their needs? And then, what new strategies might you consider in the future? To assist you in the self-reflection, I added a slide with some very specific questions to generate some thoughts. Self-reflection is a humbling process, but it's essential to find out why one thinks, says, and does certain things, and then to be able to better oneself. Thank you, and I hope that this has been helpful. I have also added a slide with some resources for your use in your future endeavors.